Hey, Chris Courtney here. New Pragmatic. It's a weird feedback loop. It's weird. It's loop, but it's going to be more of a looped. And if you know anything about the program, you know what that means. A lot of students are in career mode, and what I mean by career mode is they are working on career projects. I do mentorship for people who are working in the industry. So a lot of this morning's submissions can't be really discussed on the live stream. So I'm going to do a mini live stream here, and we're going to talk specifically about Katie's project. Um, Katie has um, Katie has some questions related to her file, and I wanted to kind of walk through a couple of things because she's asking spacing questions, and there are a couple different ways to tackle that in Figma. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we are going to tackle this in a couple of really direct ways. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to look at spacing. She was asking how do we make sure that this label here, this nav bar has equal spacing from the top. And one of the ways that I would like to encourage you to look at this nav bar as as not just something that you bring in as individual elements, because currently the way this is set up, she's got group 40. So some of this has been this is grouped really heavily together, and it's not really a frame yet. So it's kind of like this is drawn. It's not a frame. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a frame just for our purposes. We'll just say frame selection, and that made it into a frame. And now we can call this menu. I guess intro. Like I would encourage Katie. I'd encourage you to figure out what you would like to call that. But now that we've got that framed, we can kind of come through and see, okay, where is, because there's a lot of grouping going on here. Actually, let's get rid of some of those. Yeah, all right, we got rid of some of the grouping that we didn't need. So final navigation's here, and then menu is here, all right? And if this is the spacing that you're really wanting, what I would suggest doing is grabbing something like menu, and coming back over to your, well, if I could get this to work, coming back over to your components, and let's figure out where your navigation is setting at. Looks like it's setting right here, and this is where I might consider making a version of your navigation. So I will pull this down. I'll paste in. Nope, sorry. I gotta go back to menu and just kind of grab that real fast. Not that this is all that important, but for consistency, it matters. So if we go ahead and apply that grid style that you've got this main grid, and we know that this menu is going to line up here with the main grid, right? So now the goal here, and again I'm going to come in and be a little more precise with that. This right now is centered, which means that it's going to cause a few problems, and I'm even going to scoot that over so that it's not the box itself that lines up with the grid, but the actual letter forms that line up with the grid. All right, so now I'm going to come in and say this shape, and the other thing I can't figure out is if we need to take into account this secondary menu that sometimes rides along. If that's the case, then I want to even move this down a little further. And what I would like to do at this point is I'm just going to grab the whole thing and make a new component out of it. And this new component would be nav, we'll call it nav labels. Okay, so nav labels. So you can give that a better name. If you've got a better name, I encourage you to give it a better name. But now we've got everything in here. If we wanted to make another version of it where you don't have that secondary menu, you could just, well, I did a poor job of deleting that. There we go. So now this is nav secondary. So nav secondary. And again, you know your naming construction, okay? So whatever your naming construct is, I would use that. But now you have one with the secondary nav, one without that secondary nav. And instead of, sorry about that, instead of coming back over and putting this together individually on this page, what I would encourage you to do is instead figure out where your, this is your nav, I would change the instance of that nav, and it doesn't look like you're actually using an instance of that nav as it stands. So I'm not going to create a component. I'll drag in this asset because you're currently not using it. So here's your component. You've got this menu thing that you want. I should not have clicked on it that way. Let's come back over. Maybe I can get this right this time. And we will just drag it in. And what this will allow you to do is when you place it on, you can see my version of it was a little too low, right? And you want yours, maybe yours needs to be on the second. You can see the difference between ours, okay? But right now, this is going to show up consistent over and over and over again, where you're going to be like eyeballing it each time. So I can always go back into the components in layers and go, oh yeah, well that wasn't supposed to line up there. It was actually supposed to be. Well, gotta get in here. So now, when you go back in, the secondary label's been updated, and we should be able to come back over to the post UI. And now it's closer to where you have it. It's not exact, but this is why I want you, instead of individually placing this label, I want you going in and saying, I know exactly where I want this to be, and placing it, and then making a component out of it so that you can use it over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, I don't want you in this situation where you're having to constantly kind of wiggle from one page to the next. Anytime you have something that you're using over and over and over again, go into your components and make a component out of it. But again, the other thing I would really strongly encourage that you do is you think about the construction of what does this nav bar look like when everything is in it. Design that first so that you know how far down this menu label needs to be. Right now, again, if we were to place this in, you might find that secondary nav is too close, and this actually needs to be further down. Okay, so just keep those considerations in mind as you're building out pieces of your component structure. This is where we go from elements to components to sections, right? And we as we graduate up, at some point, those elements that make those small elements, which are components, make the components, and the components are a collection of small elements, and then the sections are a collection of components. This is a situation where we are now putting together a section. It's not just the nav bar; it's the nav bar with a label. You could also make an argument that there are entire section. You can make an argument for the creation of an area like this as a section, rather than having to come through and individually place things. The same thing goes for like the spacing here. If you knew, now one thing I will say is, as you're creating these elements, if you're coming through and you're saying, okay, well, this starts at 308, you know, there is part of this, like I wouldn't continue going down and saying, okay, as the page gets longer and longer and longer, I'm going to begin to place these things at very specific, I'm going to begin to create larger and larger sections. There's going to be some areas where you're like, you know what, everything's going to start at 300. And that's where all of this content is going to start. And the reason I like doing that instead of like the random like 308, it's much easier to remember. Like, okay, all content starts here, and you can remember that number and apply it throughout. And that means that you have some variability. The other thing I would remember is you also have the ability to spread the spacing out. You can distribute vertical spacing, horizontal spacing. Like if I hit distribute vertical spacing, it's going to nudge it a little bit because this spacing was not equal before. All right, and those controls are things that I see a lot of students forget about when it comes time to, okay, how do I get the spacing right? The other thing I want to point out was, when you're dragging along in Figma, you will constantly get this pop up that will tell you, oh, you're 78. If I have 3 elements, I'm going to tell you what the equal spacing is between them. If I have 4 elements, I'm going to do the same thing. And when you get to the point where it's equal, like right there, it's going to lock in and tell you, oh, that's equal spacing between all the elements. Which what that means is when I go through and I do this and I say, okay, distribute horizontal space or vertical spacing, nothing's going to happen. And that's because I've already identified what the equal spacing is. So I just wanted to take that short bit to show you a couple of different ideas on ways that you can address spacing. Some are very, go into components and create new components that take into account that spacing. Others are, use the guides, use the spacing tools that Figma provides. And still others are just have a measurement for where things are supposed to start on your pages. And then if you can stay consistent with that, regardless of how the design changes, you'll know that you've been following a consistent starting point the entire time. All right, that's going to wrap it up for this really short edition of the feedback loop. I hope that you found this helpful. And if you have any questions, I'd encourage you to jump into our Discord channel and ask away. Also, if you're not already a subscriber, hit that subscribe button if you found this useful.